At what point did you decide like, hey, we're gonna bring on some other folks to help us build this thing? And what was that first hire experience like?
We always viewed it as when were we the constraints? And at that point, like would have to go higher. Because we were so focused on automation, like it was a long time before we really became the constraints. What we did is, we ended that first year, I think with like $800 of MRR. We ended the second year with like 250K of ARR. And that third year we ended with about $1 million of ARR.
Just the two of you.
Just two of us, yeah. And at that point, the first thing that broke was basically support. And we hired kind of like a fresh out of college, very junior support rep because we couldn't be responsive enough. At that point, I had an entirely full day of sales demos. It was like doing the product work. At some point, it's like, well, if we want to get back to people in like 5-10 minutes, which is like a way better customer experience, we've got to hire somebody.
Ed, thank you so much for joining me. Really looking forward to our conversation today. I guess to just like provide a little background and update, I worked for you and Klaviyo for the last like 4 years. It was really kind of like my entry into tech sales and the tech industry in general. An amazing 4 years, like learned so much. Started out as kind of like an entry-level BDR and grew up through the org and learned so much from like the folks that have been working on the go-to-market side. And throughout that process, like I ended up meeting you, which was a really great opportunity. I think we met for the first time in Las Vegas at the sales kickoff. And then from there, like, especially early on, like when we were just getting off the ground with First Touch, like you gave Jared and I some really great advice in terms of how we should be thinking about building the business and when we should be thinking about, the database versus users versus like kind of the balance there. So just wanted to start off by saying like, really appreciate everything that you've done and all the advice that you've given us, and also the opportunity to have like cut my teeth in the tech space. So with that in mind, like pumped to chat with you today, and I have a lot of great stuff to go through with you.
No, thanks for having me. Super, super excited for it.
Cool. So we're gonna take a little bit of a walk backwards, and I think like as we're starting to build First Touch, right? A lot of what we're thinking about is like, okay, we've developed this technology. Where are we going to take this technology? Who's going to end up being like the main power user? And I'd love to walk back towards the early days of Klaviyo when you were running like the go-to-market engine, right? And you and AB are like building out this technology, and you're trying to figure out like where is this going to fit best, and where can you gain that early traction? So I guess I'd love to learn. Like, we'll start with a pretty specific question, but like, what was like one of the most challenging moments early on where you're like, what are we doing with this? Like, where are we going to take this thing?
Yeah, I mean, so we started in 2012. At the beginning, we had a bunch of different business idea and hypotheses, but our thesis was always, a business is fundamentally you find someone who has a problem. In our case, we knew how to solve problems with software, so if we could solve that problem for people, and then people would hand us a credit card and pay us. You could build a real business. And if you have enough of those people, you could build a really large business. And so, in terms of what the hardest problems were, I think, we didn't start by, building slide decks or pitching to VCs. It was all kind of like take a hypothesis, build them out. And early on, we would probably pivot kind of exactly who the end person we were selling to was every couple of months. We'd pivot exactly what the product was every couple of months. And so there were definitely these moments where we'd have an idea based on some experience. So one idea was, how do we help software companies reduce churn? And we decided we were going to build a walkthrough platform that was a layer atop the web that effectively let customer success teams reduce churn by driving the behaviors they wanted to drive.
Yeah, really cool.
One of this kind of like, we interviewed person after person and got a ton of yeses of like, this is a problem. I think this would solve it. But when we started asking for credit cards, effectively found that, almost everyone wasn't willing to hand us a credit card. And, there's always some sort of barrier. It was, hey, I want to see, this technology further along. I want you to build out a bunch of these flows for me. Whatever it was, we got a ton of positive feedback, but very little like, people buying. And it was a tough time. I think it was exactly right. Like, it's exactly what we wanted because it made us pivot and move on to the next thing. But it definitely led us to be like, are we ever going to find the right thing? And so it's just, I think emotionally a tough time where you're in the midst of doing that. And meanwhile, I think we saw a lot of people taking the other path of take an idea, pitch VCs, raise money, like doing these things that had a lot of like status. They were hiring employees and having all these like great wins, and we were having a lot of failures. Quite frankly, those failures are what drove us to found the business we did, but it certainly was like personally tough.
It's so interesting because like, you guys, and I think it's pretty well known, like you guys bootstrapped to about $1 million in revenue. Um, what did it look like when you were first starting? Like, were you and AB both in alignment? Like, look, we're not going to raise money. We're going to go try to find a problem together. Did you have an initial problem that you were like, we're going to solve this? Like, how did it start?
No, we very much had an approach versus a specific problem. So we had a bunch of ideas and starting points based on things we'd experienced in our past lives or things we're currently doing. And so we weren't beginning from nothing, but we were pretty clear that like we were going to commit ourselves to a year or two. So we'd set aside savings. We kind of cut personal costs. We've done everything we could such that we'd have enough runway to really make this work. But it wasn't, we must solve this type of business or we must be passionate about this specific thing. We really were passionate about the idea that we could go solve these problems in the world. And so in the early days, it was, the way we split things up was basically Andrew was going to be building prototypes all day, every day. And I was going to be doing, everything to kind of like find problems, figure out kind of like what that prototype might look like, and then getting people to actually buy it and finding people to talk to. And that roughly modeled our background. So we both worked at a startup previously where we'd met. Andrew was an engineer there. I joined as early enough that I was an engineer. I did sales, I did support, I did kind of like literally everything. And over time, kept kind of doing everything, and then ultimately started their product management function. So we kind of just did that. And then what it was, even like the name of it, just like was constantly evolving. We were stealing space from the MIT like entrepreneurship center. There was a building that was getting torn down, and like they basically let people just kind of squat there and work. And what the guy who runs it still gives us a really hard time because like every time he'd come by, he'd be like, all these people have these like businesses. You guys, I have no idea what you're doing. Like you are always here and you are always working very hard, but it's like very unclear what you're doing in the way that all these other companies had like names and pitches and like the whole thing. And we were just always kind of heads down trying to figure it out.
Yeah, it's really unique, right? Like you listen to all of these stories of how these companies got started and like, I can't say that I've heard a ton of stories where it's just like, hey, we knew that we could tackle problems together and we went on a journey to go find the problem that we were going to go solve for. Like such an interesting way of building a business. And obviously you guys have done like a really phenomenal job with it. I guess I'm curious, like, what was the first moment that you were like, okay, like maybe we're onto something now? And maybe it wasn't the eventual, idea or technology that you ended up kind of moving forward with, but what was the first point where you're like, hey, someone just like put up their credit card, like maybe we're onto something now?
Yeah, I think it really came kind of 8 months into this whole journey. And at this point, we'd pivoted to an idea. We'd stuck with that thread of customer service teams. That led us to an idea of, hey, there's a lot of business out there who build relationships digitally who don't have great customer information. And so, in our case, we started with the idea of like, hey, if you think about the users of a software tool, they've told you a ton about themselves, but all the information is hidden or lost to time. And so we built this customer database to say, so you knew exactly what your customers had done and not done and when and who they were and everything, all the information they'd given you. And then atop that, we'd layered this segmentation engine. And we built that, but then we went to one of these like entrepreneurship-y, startup-y dinners. And the guy sitting next to us was from Hong Kong. His family still lived in Hong Kong and had a series of suit factories. And he was running a business in the US where he would sell people suits, but he would send the measurements back to the factories and then get custom-made suits at a much better price. And
Really cool.
he was doing, it was a great product, business called Blank Label, still running. Great guy overall. He'd grown up in Australia and ended up in Boston for school. So what we, as we talked to him, what we found out he was doing is he would go back and manually look at the customer information who'd purchased previously, and then manually send them emails to say, hey, you bought the suit for a wedding last year. I see you haven't purchased again in a year. Like, do you need another? Or hey, if you realized it was for work, he'd say like, hey, you bought 2 suits. Do you need a third suit? And he could email those people more often. But he was manually doing kind of this like intelligence and data atop it. And we realized like, hey, this is like, we built the customer database. If we add messaging to our platform, like we could just make this like entire task, everything you're doing manually, we can make it go away. And we said, hey, look, would you give us a credit card? And he, very quickly said yes. Like I absolutely would pay for a service that would do this. And so that was a moment where it was like, okay, it feels like this use case is not unique. That there's like probably a lot of other people's like Fan in this case. Fan was the guy's name. And then we pretty quickly in a couple months later had found the next like 4 or 5 people who kind of fit the exact same model. And that's when it was really like, okay, we don't know how big this thing's going to be, but there's clearly something here. There's clearly this like problem that exists. We clearly have built the thing that solves it, or we built most of the pieces, and people are willing to pay for it. And so it felt like a real inflection point in what we were trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So I guess I'm curious, before you had that conversation, you had built this database with like a segmentation layer. Like, what led you to building that? Had you had another conversation with someone like in a different industry? And you're like, oh, this kind of seems to make sense here. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, so a couple things. I would think one was just the context we came from. So the first startup we worked at was this company called Applied Predictive Technologies. What they were doing was building business analytics and testing software for very large businesses. So for the largest retailers, the largest banks, and ultimately that company grew a ton and sold to MasterCard, kind of as they're in the process of thinking about going public. And so what we spent a bunch of time doing there was, companies would start with their, biggest initiatives, like, hey, should I change the prices of my like core things that I'm selling? Or should I change all my ATM fees? Or should I change my checking account, yields? And what they would do, one of the things we had to do as kind of like junior folks is they actually built this customer database effectively where they would, and then business database where they'd say, okay, say I'm a Starbucks, hypothetically, and I'm going to raise the price of a cup of coffee. If I want to understand, what happens when I do that, say I pick, 20 stores to make those changes in, I need to understand everything that's sold in those stores, kind of down to the minute. I need to understand the inventory in those stores. I need to understand kind of like the time clock data. So like who's clocked in or out to know if the store is understaffed or overstaffed or what that looks like. I need to understand where that store is so I can go look up the weather to know if it's like it rained a whole bunch of a period of days.
Yep.
And I need to like look up a bunch of real estate data. Is it in a Target or a mall or, what does that look like? If I get all that data in one place as a central customer database, like all this fragments data, I could then, really run a much smaller test, get much more exact in my analysis about what was actually happening when I changed the price of a cup of coffee. And so we had this hypothesis or just this knowledge that like, hey, data fragmentation was was a real problem out in the world that the biggest enterprises were trying to solve. And if you were going to do really good analysis was something that was going to be a problem. And so that was the context we came from. As we were just working on this customer success idea of the layer atop kind of the web that would teach people to use software applications. Once people wouldn't give us the credit card for that, we said, okay, what's the next problem? And kind of we realized one step deeper was people were struggling to build those walkthroughs, partially because they didn't understand who their customers were or what they were doing. And so we said, okay, in our past life, this having all this data, fragmented was a problem. And now we're seeing that this like churn thing is a problem. Like people were saying yes to the churn issue in customer success. What if we unified those two? And so we built this customer database that effectively combined, hey, like all the usage data of somebody of a software application, as well as like all the financial data. Okay, like when did they buy, any support interactions, like that whole thing. And so that led us to building this customer database and segmentation engine.
It's so super interesting. So in some ways, it sounds like it was almost meant to be like B2B in the beginning, like for software companies. Is that relatively accurate?
When we would pick a idea, we'd pick someone to try to sell to. We intentionally picked because of this idea of like, look, we're going to solve a problem and people are going to give us a credit card. That largely initially drove us towards B2B. It's also where our experience had been, but we steered away from big enterprises because we wanted quick learning cycles. And so we focused on SMBs. We knew we could very quickly run through reps on the business. And so that's why we started, or one of the early hypotheses was, okay, sell to software companies, something we knew something about, sell to customer success teams. We kind of knew how to find those. And so the first business, first idea, selling this walkthrough software we decided that wasn't going to work. Second, let's sell them this customer database software. The third was actually, okay, let's stick messaging atop that platform. And that's ultimately what led us, and this conversation led us to e-commerce, which really is like B2B. It's like us selling to these e-commerce businesses. But if you look at like the Wayback Machine at our website for those first few years, and if you looked at our first 20 customers, it was oftentimes like half e-commerce, half software companies that we were selling to. And it was only after maybe 18 months that we said, okay, look, the more we can standardize and focus, the faster we can grow, especially while bootstrapping, which led us to say, okay, yes, this product works well for software. Let's focus on e-commerce because, there's a lot of those businesses. They all look and feel much more similar. We'll get a ton of traction there. And then over time, we can always like grow into new verticals and new target customers.
Yeah. So before you got to the Shopify point, right, which is where things like really started to accelerate, what was the process like of kind of enabling those first 20 customers, right? It sounds like they probably had similar challenges with the segmentation side and being able to really understand the customer base. But what did that look like for you and Andrew, like on the product and go-to-market side of how you actually like plugged into these businesses and how you were able to get them up and operational and really successful on the Klaviyo platform?
Yeah, I mean, so first we for the first 6 months or so, we conceived of it as an add-on to other marketing platforms. So we're like, hey, look, we're going to power some of the messaging, we're going to power the customer database segmentation, but there'll always be like something else that powers the like dumb email campaigns side by side with it. So on the product engineering side, we made this choice of, look, if we want to grow fast and we want to learn fast, we need to take humans out of everything setup wise. And so everything was optimized around you should be able to like show up, sign up, use the product, and get going. And for some businesses, if you were at that point, like of the first few customers, like several were on Shopify, those integrations should basically be like point and click. And so Shopify was easy. Other e-commerce platforms didn't quite work the same way. Certainly Magento didn't, but we leaned in early to try to we would still work with those platforms. For non-e-commerce, it very much was you needed, you were a software company, you typically needed a developer. And so we just tried to really streamline the docs so that like somebody could pick that up and do it without us. So that was true on in terms of like the how we built out that. On the go-to-market side, I think what we very quickly arrived on was like, basically had this idea that the way to think about sales for any startup until you have hundreds of customers is really as your, one, a learning machine, and then two is a like way to help customers and kind of like teach them almost like it was almost like customer success. Like you were teaching them how to use the tool. And so leaned in quickly with, okay, going to super handhold everyone who comes on board. As part of that, learn how we could do it then better the next way, either by changing the product or by changing some of the documentation. And also would try to like condense everything. And so like if somebody came in for a sales call, like we would fully set up the product, we would like get it fully running. It would be like ready just to hit the on button as soon as they gave us the credit card by the end of the sales call. And so the combination of both those, really let us get to a point where we kind of could do as much as possible with just two of us, because otherwise we quickly would have, like we would have been the key limits to scaling.
Yeah, it's such a good point. Like early on, the sales process is really the learning arm of the business, and being able to create a feedback loop for product, and then being able to create a feedback loop for the process. And it's so interesting that like it was a forcing function. Like, hey, we have to be hyper efficient because it's just the two of us and we're bootstrapped, and so it made you guys build a business in a really scalable way. I guess I'm curious, like having been bootstrapped in the early days, like were you thinking about how big could this market potentially be, or was it really more focused on like, hey, like let's just see if we can make these customers really successful? Like, I guess curious how big of a component that was in like the decision-making process.
Yeah, I mean, we were super ambitious, so we wanted to ideally build a large company, like a large, fast-growing company. I think the idea, like if we just sat back and thought about market size, which you like didn't spend a ton of time doing, but the market size didn't seem to be the constraint. And so whether that was, I think we would have said, if you asked us at the time, we would have said, yeah, maybe e-commerce is the focus now, but in 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, like we'll jump from e-commerce to, at the time we still thought actually it was e-commerce software. So it's like e-commerce software to hospitality to all these other new things. So we would have thought that we would have like expanded out of those very quickly. So we thought about it a lot though in terms of like what the constraint was on what could let us grow faster. And we basically didn't believe it was people. And so we kind of thought of it as like, okay, for every job, there's like a job to be done that's going to come in the door. We're going to do it, and then we're going to try to automate it. And if we automate it or make it more efficient, then like that job will take us less, long over time. But and if we do that, like eventually, yes, we'll like playbookized it and then like hire people to do the thing that we've been doing. But you better to have like ironed out all those kinks and automate as much as you can before you like bring that next person in. Plus, just like economically, your business will be better and more efficient and more capital efficient. And so we just kind of thought of it that way about like how do we, reduce complexities in the business and automate things and eliminate inefficiencies.
Yeah. And I think the piece that the point that you made there was really interesting in the beginning too. You were like, hey, we thought this might last like 6 or 7 months in e-commerce. The reality is like that lasted several years, right? And still is like a very core component, if not the most core component to Klaviyo today. I guess what's your advice for like entrepreneurs that are kind of in the earlier stage building today? Like, I think there's a lot of tendency to like, we want to try different things, but we find a little bit of success in one area. And there's always this balance of, should I be trying more things and trying to learn about new industries and build into those other industries, or should I be doubling down in this one core area? Like, I guess, what is your advice to an early stage entrepreneur in terms of how far they should go in one place before they think about moving or pivoting to another?
I mean, the way I think about this is at the end of the day, businesses are effectively equations. And so you're trying to build an equation where it's going to cost you X dollars to go find a customer. And then kind of like an additional, Y dollars of like how much it'll cost you to support them kind of like month in, month out. And they're going to pay you, Z dollars over, monthly or yearly or whatever that is. And if you can, and then I guess that's an equation of how much money you can make per customer. And then if you like multiply that by how many of those customers there are, that like will determine the size of your business. If you think about, where you need to be, the key thing in the early days is like proving you have a viable business, right? And the more you can simplify and streamline that to prove out you have a viable business, the better off you are. And so being hyper-focused not on the product engineering side, like at Klaviyo, we very much said, okay, build the product to be generic enough, like generic that we could ultimately easily pivot into these other markets. But for the rest, for all the other kind of like things we're focused on, focus those on the marketing materials, the how we find leads, the sales decks, focus all of that on a very specific type of customer. Just really simplified the problem. Now, so I think we're at large. If you can do that, it just like means you can cut a lot of stuff out that you don't have to think about. I think the flip side is you want to make sure you can only do that if you know that once you've kind of like arrived where we had, which is like we had those 20 customers and they like looked like all types. And we were like, hey, I think e-commerce is like really it. So I think if you're in learning phase where you're like, hey, there's 10 customer types and like 8 of these might be duds, then it's probably too early to focus. But once you can, it just is like very freeing by letting you spend a lot less time on things, which is ultimately really important when like time is your biggest constraint as an entrepreneur.
Right. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit. So you got through the phase of kind of finding this product market fit, right? You had your first 20 customers. Shopify looked like it was potentially going to be a great partner. At what point did you decide like, hey, we got to bring on some other folks to help us build this thing? And like, what was that first hire experience like?
Yeah, I mean, so and the emphasis is not for a very long time after that. And so we always viewed it as, when were we the constraints? And at that point, like we would have to go higher. Because we were so focused on automation, like it was a long time before we really became the constraints. And so what we did is, we ended that first year, I think with like $800 of MRR. We ended the second year with like 250K of ARR. And that third year we ended with about $1 million of ARR.
Just the two of you.
Just two of us, yeah. And at that point, the first thing that broke, things broke. Well, at some point it was also, we're generating lots of cash. And so at some point in that, around, I guess, the 250K point, it's like, okay, we could more than pay our salaries and pay the business costs. And we started just to stick the money in the bank. At some point, it's like, okay, the money's just going to the bank. It's like not doing anything for the business. So like, let's like think, bring our heads up and think about it, but also be mindful of where, we are the constraints. The first thing that broke was basically support. And we hired kind of like a fresh out of college, very junior support rep, really just to like, because we couldn't be responsive enough. At that point I was doing, I had an entirely full day of sales demos. Was like doing the product work and was like, we and I were both doing the support. He was like doing all the coding. And at some point it's like, well, if we want to get back to people in like, 5-10 minutes, which is like a way better customer experience, we've got to hire somebody. And so that was the first hire, which we made, I think in the summer of kind of like 2.5 years in. And then, not too long after, maybe 3 or 4 months later, we hired, we did kind of like our next class of folks, which ended up being two things. So one, we hired 2 sales reps. And at that point we were, I was just like literally couldn't do all the sales demos. And so it's like, okay, we weren't entirely clear who we needed. We had, of our customers then, we'd really focused on e-commerce, but we had small-ish brands. We also had like significantly larger brands. And it was unclear how important it was going to be to get different skill levels of reps. And somebody had said, hey, look, if you hire 2 people at once, like 1, people learn from each other. 2, you'll have like a much better way to copy each other, and you can get like, start to learn more about profiles. And so we hired 1 person with some experience, but less experience, 1 person with a lot more experience. The junior person had no software sales experience. The more senior person had some software sales experience. So I hired those 2 and then hired a couple engineers. And that was kind of the initial class of folks. And then I want to say in the next 6 months, we hired 1 or 2 more engineers, and we hired 6 kind of like basically BDRs. At that point, like the BDR engine was working, the outbound engine was working, the inbound was working. And so hired 6 BDRs who ended up being a mix of some kind of like status BDRs, 1 person ended up doing like marketing, couple ended up doing support, and then some who are still there and, still at Klaviyo on like a variety of different functions and roles. But that was kind of like what the first 10 people looked like.
Yeah. So I guess dialing in a little bit on the first hires, what were your thoughts around building the company culture at that point? And, really being selective about those first few hires. I think it's like pretty common mistake these days. Like the first 10 hires kind of decide the culture, determine some of the culture of the company longer term. What was the process like for you and AB of figuring out who those first hires would look like? And are those principles still kind of applied today?
Yeah, I'd say we made a ton of mistakes. We also did some things right. We'd come from the first startup we worked at had like a very rigorous recruiting, training, people-focused process that was very performance-focused. And so that was definitely a model we wanted to aspire to. Now, there were definitely some other roles that were just different, like than roles we'd hired for before. And so like we knew how to hire engineers like that. We'd hired tons before. We had less experience on the sales side. We like definitely didn't have experience on the junior like support customer success side. So we were very focused on, there's a few things that were like had been hard firm rules in our past lives, and like we still very much believe, just like we're not gonna work with any assholes. So like if you're a jerk, like it's like not worth it. Like you're gonna have to be humble, you're gonna be focused on the customer, like that is fundamentally important. And we're big believers in, especially that phase, like it's a startup. Like a lot of what makes this work is people who are like excited to show up every day and like solve customer problems and like hustle. And like that is something we were looking for. So, I think that, I think even though that was the framework, I think we probably should have spent more time on, how could we have been better at training and coaching and doing even more? Like we very much had we used to work in this co-working space, and we'd like, when it was 6 of us, we'd stick all of us at like a 4-person table and be like huddled around each other, like incredibly close to learn from each other. So that was great. There's probably more we could have done to figure out like, okay, where were there, opportunities for training or coaching or mentoring that we should have like spent more time on, probably gotten more, gotten focused on a performance, like performance reviews and like a kind of high performance, like written performance culture. Not because I think not because we weren't doing it at all, but more just like the value of, feedback is so valuable, both positive and negative, that it's like too easy to fall by the wayside when everybody's wearing so many hats.
Yeah. Oh, I'll say this, like, I joined Klaviyo a little over 4 years ago at this point, and I left earlier this year. But a lot of those things that you talked about, like, oh, we could have done more of this, it ended up becoming a big part of the company. And I got to live through that experience myself, being able to work on like entrepreneurship projects and being able to feel like a real owner, and being able to really build things, even within the context of a larger organization. So, it's interesting how like those takeaways, like in my opinion at least, really kind of like built into the longer term version of what the culture at Klaviyo looked like. So really kind of cool to see the later end of that. Yeah. Cool. So, we've talked a lot about kind of the early days, what it looked like to build the team. A lot is changing right now, in the future of what marketing software is going to look like and sales software. I've had a lot of conversations with businesses that are starting to see those two functions of the business merging closer and closer together, especially on like the B2B SaaS side, right? Like this might be a little bit less popular in the e-commerce space, right? Where like you have to be able to speak in a personalized way, one to many. Whereas on the SaaS side, B2B, it's like you have a big sales team and, you have the ability to communicate one-to-one. I guess I'm curious, like what your thoughts are in terms of the direction that we're heading in and the capabilities that AI is bringing to like folks at Klaviyo that are using the software today.
Yeah. The underlying thesis of Klaviyo, kind of like once we, gotten the tour out, once we had those first 100 customers, I think ultimately what we realized was, software for so long has been built to really be like a tool to enhance what people are doing. And, if you look at Excel, it's like you don't get a lot with Excel, but like somebody who can do amazing things with Excel can like, drive a ton of value. And that's also how we thought about like coding languages. It's how we thought about like tools like Salesforce. Like it's always been kind of like you take this like kind of dumb tool, but like that saves you a bunch of time, add a human who provides all the intelligence, and then it like, magic can happen. And early on in Klaviyo, I was like, okay, well, if you add in the, like vertically integrate the data and the tool, all of a sudden the tool, doesn't have to be dumb and you don't have to pay a huge cost to like integrate those. The tool can be a lot smarter, and then the human can spend a lot less time on like things they either don't want to do or can't do, and they can add a ton of value in a bunch of other ways. And I think that thesis is still playing out, and there's still like huge swaths of the software market that like haven't yet, like moved to this like batteries included data model. So I think that's, number one. I think AI is kind of like number two, which is once you do that, all of a sudden, with the existence of kind of more AI tooling, both generic, models that exist kind of like across any company, as well as then like models, built specifically for certain use cases. When you have the combination of vertically integrated data in the tooling plus AI that's a lot more sophisticated than it's been in the past, the ability to have software that like truly drives outcomes is vastly enhanced. And so I think we'll start to see basically like that sort of tooling will start to exist more and more. You'll see a lot more integration across tooling, more consolidation in markets. And, what we'll see is that kind of like the combination of people plus this tooling lets people kind of like do a lot more and drive like way better results than doing things they could never have done historically.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because even when I was at Klaviyo, and kind of starting my career there was always this ability not only to consolidate your tech stack, but to consolidate the amount of people that had to work on the project, right? Like everything was click and point. It allowed for the creative in the room to be able to build out the marketing strategy without needing all of the technical resources that would typically go into maybe some of the other technologies in the space. I won't name names, but it allowed for like the person who had the creative ideas to really build out the strategy in a meaningful way. Um, as we start to think about like technology in today's day and age, if you were to, be starting a new company today, and I guess this is kind of like a question about advice, right? But um, there's a couple different trains of thought. One is, okay, you can create a wedge, right, with a kind of a point solution. It's like it does this one thing really well. Um, or you can go out and say, okay, we want to build something more substantial, something that could potentially come into a market and consolidate a lot of different tools. Like, what would your thought process be or advice be to someone who's kind of entering a new market today with the technological advancements that have been made over the last few years?
Yeah. I mean, I think it comes back to that, idea of a business as an equation. Like you ultimately have to solve some sort of problem that exists. And so if you can do that, um, if you can do that with a point solution tool, and then over time work your way backwards into, hey, that, like drives more value across like multiple dimensions. It's tremendously powerful. I think that's basically what we did with Klaviyo. It's like we said, okay, we built the customer database. We're going to specifically focus on sending these like triggered communications, and we're going to be like plug into like these other platforms. That let us both, we had still to build a lot. Like we had to solve the one hard technical problem was like building this customer database. We had to solve that problem. And there was no getting around that. Like that had to be solved for us to have to deliver the value. But it let us like really focus on like, okay, I'm not gonna, go into a sales process and you're gonna be like, hey, I love these like 35 features in this like marketing platform, and you've got 2 of them. I can instead say like, yeah, whatever you've got there is great. We can make you more money because we can like enhance that. And then over time, that gave us like runway to go build, everything else. So I think the point solution, a path can like very much work, but it actually doesn't mean you can't build the differentiating feature, and you can't take an approach that like doesn't, if you think about like either, whether your differentiator is the data, your differentiator is the AI, the differentiator is like the combination of both. At the end of the day, you're selling outcomes. You have to be able to actually sell that outcome to make it work. And so there's like no getting around it. So it works in the point solution. I think it can work on the platform side. You just have to think about, just depends on your market, your team, your fundraising, or your bootstrapping, like what that is. It's kind of just, I think both strategies can work. It's all about your constraints.
Cool. In like, as you started to build out the functionality in Klaviyo, did it go from like leveraging other people's UI to bringing them into the Klaviyo UI fully, or did that happen kind of progressively as you built out your feature set and people were like, oh, well, Klaviyo is working great for this, like we want to do more with them?
Yeah, I mean, we immediately, had a belief that like you have to be in our UI. And so like we actually had a competitor trying to do kind of what we were doing, but in the other company's UI. The basic belief is like if you're in somebody else's UI, like you don't control the customer, which it could be fine. It's just like it adds a lot more challenge. And so we said, okay, we're going to control the UI. And what we were doing was sufficiently different in our case that like that was fine. After a few months, we pretty quickly realized people don't want multiple UIs, especially the bigger the company gets, like the more problematic it is. If you have a bunch of users, like that's problematic. In our case, if you're managing messaging, there's like all these compliance issues with being in multiple systems. So we could not have built a big business as an add-on. And in fact, to be a big business, we had to pivot pretty quickly to the full, like, great, today you buy X, we're going to sell you Y. We're a premium version of X that's cost 25% more because we had this like customer database. That's what let us then like start to ramp our growth and like really laser in. It also made the sales process much easier because you could go in and be like, you're currently spending, so many dollars on this current tool, and you just like take those dollars and give them to us and like a little bit more like that. That's a much easier sales process than like create a new budget.
Right.
So, I think in our experience, we like had to make that pivot pretty quickly. And I think that's like generally true, is that find a start. Like as you're in that learning phase, getting to your first 100 customers, like you kind of make whatever work you need to, but in the long term, you probably end up needing to be like your own thing in a lot of B2B software markets. I think that's like not universally true.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. I mean, like, because Klaviyo owns the data and the workflow, right? Some companies don't control the data. They just control the workflow. Some just control the opposite, right? It's a really powerful combination to be like vertically integrated and own the whole stack, right? The data, the experience, the segmentation engine, and the workflow. So curious, this is kind of a general question, but like in the early days and even progressing throughout scaling the company, like what were the personality traits that you looked for and that you felt best resonated like with the Klaviyo mission?
Yeah, I mean, it was catching up with someone who I worked with at the first startup, and that company, of all things, was a tech startup like in Washington D.C. So there were like very few other tech startups around. A couple of the founders happened to live there. We were recruited out of college, so ended up there. But I was catching on someone about the culture of that company, and there was a lot of things we learned there that when we directly applied at Klaviyo. And I think fundamentally, it was just like very much like ownership was a very strong value, ownership and hustle. But very much in like no one is like too good for anything. Like you were all in it together. You were super customer focused, and you were just going to do whatever you could to deliver a ton of value for them. And that meant like you had a job, like there's a specific job you kind of like had and were hired for. But like at one point, like I'd been very focused on working with a bunch of our biggest customers, and like some of those I ended up with more free time. I ended up like coding a bunch of like database analyses tooling to like make sure there weren't any mistakes in our database. I wasn't like on the engineering team, but it was just like, well, I can do this, like just go do it, right? And that's how I ended up like starting product management there too. It's like you just kind of like picked up work and did it, and like would help each other out, and like that I think is we thought about Klaviyo's kind of like fast forward to like years later, the same idea of like one like what lets startups move so fast and like do great things for customers is when you're like in constant learning mode, but you're like super focused on how do you like go out, solve the problems in any way you need to, and you're very reactive. And at the same time, what makes it fun but also effective is you're doing this as a team. You're a team where you can like learn from each other. Everybody has different skills, and you can try to be kind of mightier as a group than you would be as a single person. And that's really, I think, what made it fun in the early days, but also what we really aspired to is to say, hey, who are the people where like, they show up at Klaviyo and they're like, it's like, great. I like see a way to make a difference, and I like go do it. I see like some new way to add value or some way we're doing something wrong, and I'm like, try to go fix it. That like humble ownership, hustly, customer focused stuff was like really the magic of it.
That's awesome. And it's funny because now at First Touch, we're a team of about 10 people now. And Jared and I have taken a lot of the learnings that we had from Klaviyo and like the way that the culture was built there. And we're now plugging that into the way that we, aspire to build the culture of the company and the way that we operate and the way that we communicate with each other. So it's fun to think that like, from your start, bringing that into Klaviyo, and now we're bringing that into First Touch. This has been an awesome conversation, Ed. Like, really appreciate all of the insights. I think, for me personally, like a lot of really great learnings, even from this conversation right here, that I'm now starting to think about of like, how can we apply this at First Touch? But yeah, really appreciate you for like carving out the time and spending the time just like, really providing a lot of guidance to Jared and I throughout the process.
No, super fun. Hopefully you take some of the learnings from Klaviyo, but also see the things that we weren't done good or messed up, and say like, hey, like we can just like do this a lot better. So, but any pain we can, anytime you can like hopefully save somebody some of the pain you've been through is always tremendously valuable.
Yeah, well, we're certainly hitting our own speed bumps, but powering through them as much as we can. So Yep.